we are now at 5 minutes past the hour, whichever hour you are in. I think it's a good time to get started. I am David Santo. I'm coming to you from Montreal, and I will be providing a short introduction and then stepping out of the way for our presenters to take it away. So thank you, first of all, on behalf of the Canadian Association for Food Studies, CAFS, for being here. This is our third webinar in a series that we just started last year. And I'd like to welcome you to what I think will be a very engaging and hopefully provocative exchange between our two wonderful guests. So I wanted to thank very much Shannon Fraser and Sarah Martin at Memorial University, who've made it possible for us to connect technologically. Shannon is going to be our technical facilitator. She is lurking there in the background, and she's arranged for our ASL interpreter and the use of the Webex platform through Memorial's Nexus Centre for Humanities and Social Science Research. So a big shout out to Memorial and Nexus as well. This webinar represents a set of connections that span many regions of Turtle Island, a land that remains largely unceded by the first peoples who were here in earliest times, and which continues to bear the effects of historic and recursive forms of colonialism. It's also a place that's highly implicated in food production, processing, transport, and export, all of which are also tightly enmeshed with historical and continuing forms of dispossession, domination, accumulation, and control. So as we gather virtually, we want to acknowledge our presence and participation in this place and in such systems. And hopefully through our guests' critical take on food and nutrition, we hope to contribute to a set of longer-term efforts to redress and reorient the very problematic effects of colonialism, both within food and human bodies, and for the larger scale of societies and nations. So for this and many reasons, I'm delighted to welcome Alissa Overend and Jennifer Brady, our two webinar presenters today. Alissa is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and the coordinator of the Gender Studies minor at McEwan University. Jennifer herself is a registered dietitian and an assistant professor in applied human nutrition at Mount Saint Vincent University, where she uses critical and feminist theory to explore intersections of food, health, and social justice. The webinar is going to be composed of 3 distinct chunks, including a discussion of Alissa's wonderful new book, Shifting Food Facts, Dietary Discourse in a Post-Truth Culture. There will hopefully then be some nice lively venting about the truths that make Alissa and Jennifer mad, and why they make them mad, and what we can think about that. And then finally, some advice for the rest of us to take away on how to adapt our own understanding and thinking and talking about nutritional science in the work that we do. So as I mentioned, we are very grateful to have Karina Burris, our ASL interpreter, with us today. Her video will remain on for the duration as she signs the discussion of our 2 speakers. If you need to, you can make some adjustments in your Webex interface to make sure that the videos that you want to see remain on screen, as well as the presenter slides. So with that, I will stop speaking and turn it over to Alissa, and Jennifer, so we can get on with the webinar. Thank you both again very much for being here and for taking the time.
Thank you so much, David. I have just a couple of notes myself to begin. I just wanted to first start out, I was just telling David before we started that I've newly become a primary school teacher, as schools in Nova Scotia have been shut down for 2 weeks given COVID restrictions. So kind of sorry, not sorry, but I might be interrupted a few times by my 9- and 6-year-old who don't really understand what it is that I do. And so they don't really care that I'm in a webinar right now. So sorry, not sorry. Next note is the title that Alissa and I have given the presentation today is Spilling the Tea, Serving Up Nutrition Realness in the Post-Truth Era. And I just wanted to speak to the title for a moment so you could understand, for those of you that are not Drag Race fans, where the title's coming from. So Spilling the Tea, if you have not yet watched RuPaul's Drag Race, is a common phrase used on the show, which basically means spilling the truth. So, you know, give me the truth, talk to me about what's going on, is what that means. And then serving up realness is you'll have to watch the show. I won't get into that. And so, yeah, that leads us into a synopsis that I'm going to begin with. Alissa, could you, I think you have control. Perfect, thank you. So I'm going to begin with a synopsis of the book. And then, as David mentioned, we're going to get into some later sections where Alissa and I will discuss some of the ideas that she's working with in the book, and then also try to extend those ideas a little bit beyond to think about how they speak specifically to food studies and food studies in Canada, understanding what the book means for our work as food studies scholars and as people interested in food systems change, or as well health and nutrition. So by way of a synopsis, I wanted to begin with the provocative excerpt that is on the slide in front of you that appears in the introductory chapter of the book. And I begin with this quote partly because I think it is so provocative, but it really also just speaks to the central thesis of the book. And so Dr. Overend writes, if we are only concerned with separating food fact from food fiction, we perpetuate the politically dangerous and epistemologically narrow idea that there is only one way to eat healthy. And I want to unpack that a little bit because I want to highlight that what Alissa is getting at here is not just that there are different foods that make us healthy or different forms of dietary patterns that are associated with health, but that we need to unpack the very roots of how we understand what it means to be healthy, to undertake health practices, and how food and nutrition fits within that, within those sort of systems of thought. And so it's not just about, a variety of foods make us healthy or a variety of dietary patterns make us healthy, but that understanding in this current historical moment, we have a very sort of taken for granted and often unquestioned way of understanding food and health, which is that there are truths that can be known about food and nutrition, and that those truths can be known primarily through science, and that those don't change. That because we've discovered facts about, or what we believe are facts today about food and nutrition, that those are unchanging realities of food and nutrition. More to that point, the book really calls into question the way that what is healthy is, when we say healthy eating or nutritious food or nutritious diets, we are calling upon a particular epistemological approach to understanding food and health, which is positivism. So for people that are maybe unfamiliar with this idea or this term epistemology, what that in short means is the ways that we create knowledge, or the ways that we create knowing what can be known about a thing. And with respect to the book, Alissa's calling into question our sort of taken for granted view that food, nutrition, and health can be understood through a positivist epistemology, or in other words, through science. Things can be quantified, and those things that we can quantify are what we then call truths, or what we call then facts about food, as well as about health. And that's very much connected to, as I was saying, this sort of taken for granted view that we have of health, which calls on a particular framing in understanding health through a very biophysiological model that abstracts what is healthy food from the social, cultural, historical, political, economic contexts in which the food is produced, distributed, consumed, prepared, who prepares it, for example. And then further to that it's just simply healthy food and healthy eating is simply about individuals making choices based on the truths or facts that are known or that we think we know about food and eating. And so again, that view of food and eating very much places responsibility on individuals to be the knowers and understanders of science, and to have relationships to food and eating and health that are characterized by this prevailing view of food and nutrition that dominates how we see these things in this historical moment. And we'll get into the implications of what Dr. Overend is arguing here later on when we have a chance to have some discussion between us. So I want to highlight one of the ideas that Alissa is working with to take us a little bit deeper into the book. So as the title of the book implies, one of the key ideas that Alissa is working with is post-truth. So post-truth, just a few short years ago, was the word of the year. You may have heard it in the media, and it's often spoken about as a sort of skepticism, a significant cultural shift that has been characterized by a skepticism of experts and expertise. And Alissa uses it a little bit differently to understand the ways that we need to move beyond the framing of food and health and nutrition that I just spoke to, that seems to predominate our relationship to food and health and eating. So in the book, Alissa describes post-truth and her adoption of it as a framework for thinking beyond the attachment to empirical, substance-based food claims. And by substance-based food claims, what Alissa is getting at there is that our quantification of food, and then hence the truth that we believe we know, or we hold up as unchanging facts about food, are very much focused on the materiality of the food itself. So, we eat salmon because it contains omega-3s. We consume dairy because it contains calcium, not because of any other cultural or social or spiritual practice. So those are all abstracted from the meanings of food within this sort of post-truth relationship, or this sort of factual relationship that Alissa is arguing we need to shift beyond and see beyond and adopt post-truth to get us there. And so with that, before I move on to the next key concept that Alissa is working with in the book, is I just like actually to invite Alissa to speak to why she felt it was important, or why she felt post-truth was particularly useful in trying to unpack our relationship to food and eating and the arguments that she's making.
Sure, I'm happy to. Thanks, Jen. And I also just wanted to add my thanks to the organizers, Jennifer Brady, David Santo, Shannon Fraser, and Sarah Martin for organizing this talk. I'm joining you today virtually from Treaty 6 territory in Amiskwichi, Waskahegan, the Cree word for Edmonton. I think for many of us, we know that research is a very solitary process, and certainly this year, because of circumstances, there wasn't a formal book launch. So I'm very grateful to be having these conversations, and it's a privilege to be here today. So thank you all for joining. In terms of the post-truth and the sort of genealogical framework, I think like many people, I was finding a lot of the debates and discussions that were circulating were quite polarizing. Eat dairy, don't eat dairy, be a vegan, be a carnist, follow keto, follow plant-based, that it was becoming increasingly polarized, contradictory. And it kind of seemed that no matter where you looked, you could find support for whatever dietary patterns or food facts that you wished to follow. So there was something quite compelling for me about this post-truth. And I will speak to this a bit later. By no means am I denouncing truth or fact, or in any way supporting a kind of Trump style. I think he, at one point in the post-truth discussions, kind of got attached to the word, and I'm actively distancing myself from anything related to him in relation to that. But I think it just became a useful framework to kind of characterize the culture that many of us are finding ourselves in terms of food knowledge, in terms of nutrition knowledge, though I think that could also be applied more broadly to other things as well. Environmental truths could be another one as well. Do you want me to speak to genealogy here as well?
Yeah, if that feels natural to you, maybe I'll just preface it by saying that
Sure.
Genealogy is the main methodology that you're using, or the approach that you're using to sort of unearth the ways that truth springs from the ways of knowing. And so many of us might not be familiar with Foucault's work or what genealogy is. So yes, if you could please speak to it, that'd be lovely.
Yeah, and for me, the two are linked. So a kind of, why I adopt this post-truth is in part because of my Foucauldian academic trainings and some sort of penchants or leanings towards post-structuralism or deconstruction. And I think in much of the literature, there's a real support for acknowledging multiple or plural truths. So I'm not anti-truth entirely, but I would say I'm sort of skeptical of singular truths, which certainly comes out in the larger work. So the term genealogy, many of you may be more familiar with it in terms of a family lineage. It's a term that that has been a term and a method, excuse me, that's been normalized or framed by the French philosopher Michel Foucault. And in the same way that many of us use this term colloquially to understand a family genealogy, to sort of trace our roots or ancestry, in other words, what has come before us, Foucault uses this in an academic sense, and I do as well, to trace the histories and development of particular ideas or truths. So rather than these truths just being innate or universal or static, a Foucauldian analysis will look at the development of particular truths or facts. And I think many scholars have really been excited by this work because it opens up the social world in really interesting ways. Certainly the history of food and nutrition, again, many people in this room are likely familiar, shows great variability in our collective or cultural understandings of what's healthy and what's not. And I think that variability in those shifting truths, for me, is what's really sociologically, but also politically interesting for the work that we do. So I think genealogy in particular enables us a lens to kind of open up these seemingly static truths and to think differently about commonly held beliefs, including science as one truth. So I'm not denying science as a truth, but I would deny it as the only or singular truth. And I'm happy to speak to that in the Q&A or certainly later in our discussions today.
All right, lovely, thank you so much. So the ideas and sort of groundwork that we've just discussed really fills out the introductory chapters and chapter 1. So if you don't mind, Alissa, just flipping the slide there for me, just continue with giving folks an overview of the book. So in the next chapter, chapter 2, Alissa really digs into a useful illustration of the key ideas that we've just discussed that frame the book or that lead the sort of discussion throughout the book. So chapter 2 picks up on the genealogy of Canada's food guide to illustrate those key arguments or the key thesis of the book. And so in doing so, Alissa explores the various food industry tactics that have shaped the food guide over time versus consumers' need for information. So, of course, like Alissa has said, and I would agree, as a dietitian, but also as a critical dietetic scholar or critical nutrition studies scholar, that this isn't about throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying, well, we shouldn't be communicating any kind of nutrition information at all. That is still important. But in the current shifting context where there's not just science at play, but also the ways that various organizations or bodies capitalize on singular truths and the relationship that we have to those things. It's a balance that needs to be struck or openings that need to be found between sort of this food industry that will capitalize on singular truths to promote, Cheerios with added fiber or Lucky Charms with added fiber. Similarly, chapter 2 explores the ways that, as I mentioned earlier, there's been this sort of view of food and nutrition as being the responsibility of individuals. to make choices based on an understanding of food and nutrition, or based on a relationship of food with food and nutrition that's characterized or dominated by these scientific ways of understanding, versus the need for structural change, changes within the social, cultural, economic environments in which people live and eat. And then also chapter 2 calls into question, of course, whose knowledge of food and health has informed Canada's food guide over time, which we see shift significantly from the first iteration of the food guide in the early 1940s, which was referred to as Canada's Food Rules, which even in the early days was very much influenced by the needs of the war. And so, for example, we see in the 1944 version of the food guide, the inclusion of recommended servings of offal, of organ meats. And that was very much tied to the needs of rationing in wartime. And so, of course, with those illustrations, this gets to the point that this is very much not about just science, or that we need to call on other means of understanding food and nutrition to get at these various truths that inform what comes to be seen as the prevailing norm around healthy eating. After chapter 2 and the genealogy of the food guide, Alissa presents a number of case studies in which she picks up on important concepts from across critical nutrition studies to illustrate further the sort of, as she mentioned, very either-or perspective that undergirds our relationship to food and nutrition, even though paradoxically we seem to have this sense of food and nutrition as being knowable through single truths. So in the first case study, which focuses on dairy, she focuses on this sort of contested meaning around milk through the campaigns of Got Milk, which you might be familiar with. That was Dairy Farmers of Canada, or the Not Milk, which picks up on the ways that milk is tied with sort of industrial agriculture. And so the main idea there that Alissa picks up on is something that comes from her own work, fluid nutricentrisms. And so I was just wondering if you could explain for us a little bit, Alissa, about that concept and what for you it identifies in this sort of shifting post-truth culture of food and nutrition.
Thanks, Jen. So I work a lot with the Australian food philosopher Georgie Scrinis, which many of you may be familiar with his work, and he highlights a lot of this kind of nutricentric understanding, which I again adopt fairly widely in the book. And when I was dealing with dairy is a particularly interesting case study. And again, for those of you more familiar with food studies, I think it's drawn a lot of critical scholars in because it's such an interesting case study in terms of all of the technological changes we've made to dairy to add in vitamin D, or all of the lactose-free dairy that we see, homogenized milk, pasteurization. It's a very technological object or food item, though we also come to see it as quite natural because of its links to motherhood. We also see it, I think, in different cross-cultural analyses as a very different uptake. So dairy for me is kind of a fascinating case study because despite its almost universal understanding as both natural and healthy, a lot of the world's population actually can't digest dairy. So for me, there was a lot going on, and there was something about the fluidity of the milk, the dairy itself. It's kind of not quite as thin as water. It can be obviously a little bit more opaque. And for me, there was something conceptually interesting about that connection. And I thought of the link, of course, to Scrinis's work. So the idea not of a nutricentrism that's static, but one that shifts in relationship to changing debates about what's healthy. And in the book, I sort of trace all of the different examples of how milk has touted itself as healthy. And Jen mentioned early sort of wartime, milk at one point was seen as a growth agent. And now where we are struggling more with sort of anti-obesity discourses, it's touting itself as a weight loss agent. So two things that are completely contradictory and that respond again to the social factors. And they just kind of, they play up or play down various elements of what's actually there in a nutrient sense or in an empirical sense.
Yeah, and I'd just like to pick up on something that you said in explaining the case study around dairy. That I think is an important advancement of this concept of fluid nutricentrisms that adds to nutritionism as a concept from Skrinis's work. You mentioned the ways that we see milk because of the connection to sort of motherhood or maternal food and feeding practices. And I think that's one thing that for me has always lacked in this concept of nutritionism, which is it really hasn't attended, Skrinis really hasn't attended to the ways that this is very much informed by gender, but also racism as well. And so I think with fluid nutricentrisms, it opens up that concept, it builds on the concept to be able to better incorporate the ways that are, even picking up on motherhood, our understanding of what that looks like and what that means also shifts, and nutritionism shifts alongside of that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in the next case study, Alissa digs into sort of these either or positionings of wheat as either this global staple that is important in a lot of different ways, economically, but also in terms of health claims. And then this very opposite either or framing of it as this modern health scourge. And so in the chapter, you pick up on this idea of imperial dietetics to elucidate the ways that wheat's been implicated in Eurocentric notions of purity and white supremacy, as well as in the colonial expansion of North America. And then further to that, as you mentioned, in the sort of modern day time where we're dealing with these anti-obesity discourses, that it's very much also seen as this modern solution to the modern problem of obesity. Do you want to speak a little bit to imperial dietetics?
Again, I think this kind of focus on history really shifts our perspective. So when we think about white bread or white bread today, it's almost seen as sort of the kind of calorie dense, really cheap bread that maybe kids like, and people who don't want to go to fancy bakeries or whatnot. But when white bread first came out, it was sort of touted as sort of this brave new world, like here's store-bought bread. No longer do we have to rely on, and this is some of the language in the archive, but sort of quote unquote dirty immigrants bread and essentially women's bread. And so there's also, as Jen mentions, a kind of elision here between the discourses of food and sexisms and certainly racisms and xenophobias of the day. So brown bread and homemade bread it's revered today, but again, in the turn of industrialization, it was very much demonized and white bread was kind of held up. So I don't think those objects have changed, but the cultures and the context around it have changed. So that's part of what that chapter takes up.
Mm. And then similarly, the third case study focuses on meat. And again, another either or framing of veganism or carnism. And you sort of highlight the debate swirling around meat's various shifting roles. It's a carcinogen versus an antioxidant. It's a weight loss aid because of the protein content, but then also has this sort of risk potential for weight gain because of the fat content. It's an environmental hazard because it's so, environmentally costly versus something that actually might be beneficial for the environment. So again, these sort of either or takes on meat, as with the other case studies, both center individual responsibility for what comes to be understood as health problems, but that are actually social problems, very socially, historically rooted and constantly shifting problems. So with that, I'd like to move now to give my take on the book. overall. Perfect. Thanks for that, Alissa. So the book is, in my mind, an important contribution to the growing body of critical nutrition studies and critical dietetics. And so for me, the book builds on the work of other authors, some of which, some of the contributions of which you see on the slide in front of you. So I place this book very much as the next step in unearthing some of the other criticisms that have been published in recent years that have elucidated food nutrition as something that we tend to understand as being knowable through science, and that trickles down into individual responsibility for acting in ways that are appropriate to that science, or that reify that scientific either or understanding, bad, good, healthy, not healthy. So I would say that for those interested in a variety of fields, this book is important reading. So in critical food studies, food sociology, cultural studies, history, science and technology studies, Canadian studies, health studies, and fat studies, I think are all sort of picked up through Alissa's book. And reasons why you should definitely read this book. First of all, I think what is importantly unique about this book is that it offers Canadian context. So many of the books that you see on the slide in front of you are theoretically important, but not necessarily rooted in sort of a Canadian history, or as Alissa understands it, as a Canadian genealogy of how this has shifted in the Canadian context. Second, the book offers a thorough explanation of how a focus on questions of what constitutes healthy eating belies these social, structural meanings and roots of what and why and how people eat. I found the book to be very accessible, so definitely appropriate for students, even at the undergraduate level. But I think that in the context of these other readings, these other books, as I said, it builds on them, and I think offers important reading for scholars that are well familiar in the field. And the case studies finally provide excellent illustrations, which again, I think are very useful for student readers, but also for established scholars in the field. So that is my take on the book. I'd like to move next to digging into the book and a little bit about Alissa's process and more of her thoughts about the book. So for you, Alissa, what is this book about?
I think that question, excuse me, is a lot easier to answer now than it was at the beginning of book writing or the process of research. In hindsight, and I actually think you did a really great job summarizing it and giving some overall kind of theoretical and argument-based approaches to the book. So I appreciate that. I guess like many books or many research projects, especially larger ones, it is about a lot of things. It's about trying to make sense of these increasingly confusing and complicated foodscapes. Many of us are sort of more disconnected from food. What does that mean in terms of consumer practices and politics? What does that mean for the relationship of food in our lives? What does that mean for what we buy and what we eat and how we talk about food? And those kind of more macro-based questions. I'm also really interested, and you highlighted those pendulum swings on those case studies really nicely. To me, again, why? How did we get to this point where we're starting to see very opposing or conflicting advice about food? And no wonder the general public is confused. If us as experts in this field are also muddling through much of this stuff, then I think it makes sense that students and other people not closely related are also quite confused. Certainly, it's about moving towards this kind of critical or contextual understanding of food. So moving beyond strictly or singular scientific approaches to food, which is one part, but it cannot be the whole part. And I think ultimately there's a bit of a reclamation or a pulling back of some of this authoritative advice on food. I don't want to evoke too much of Michael Pollan's work, but I think, some of the wisdoms that our grandmothers had around food is actually quite sage if we think about it in these relational or contextual contexts in terms of food availability, not using waste, local access, time management, affordability, that these types of things, even digestibility, I think would come back to some of those ancestral or family linkages. So I think it is a little bit, again, about sort of reclaiming that personal authority, and I think true to myself as a sociologist, really bringing back in or recentering these social, political, and cultural aspects of food that somewhere just seem to kind of get sidelined, ignored, or negated. And I think when we're thinking about those in relation to health, they absolutely have to be central. Health is more than eating, your balanced amount of calories and nutrients. It absolutely has to relate to the social and political world. So accessibility to healthcare, job, income, distribution, stress levels, marginalization, et cetera, and so forth.
Mm. And not to go too far off the planned script for our questions here, but I would just add to the other aspects that are important to consider when we're talking about health, or what we think we're saying when we say health. Pleasure.
Yes.
Like I just find that is one of the biggest losses for all of us collectively and individually when we're not unpacking health. Is yes, there's social context. Yes, there's cultural context. Yes, there's spirituality, and food's important to that. And there's the pursuit of pleasure. And I feel like we've lost that.
I agree. There's some really interesting stuff coming out now on the studies of taste. And I think I probably don't speak alone when I say this, but even in a pandemic, some of my greatest pleasures have been food and drinks and making food and all of that stuff. So certainly taste has been a reliant pleasure.
Absolutely. And what's more healthy than that?
Exactly.
So what prompted you to write this book? What observations or what things that troubled you led to you writing this?
I think it was an accumulation of many things. My initial take into this work was around some of those early dairy ads that kind of would, cite, and I'm going to talk about this a little later with a tangible example, like drinking a glass of milk will make sure that you don't get cancer. And I just think what an absurd claim. And that people were also taking some of that in, that eating X equals health. And to me, again, as a sociologist trained in the particular background that I'm trained in, this was not only false, but also quite misleading. And then I found sort of similar contradictory debates or confusions in some of the health, or rather wheat and meat discourses. So I think those happened over many, many years. And then I started delving into the kind of history of nutrition with my Foucauldian lens, and just found that, and I add the image of my novice bread making skills here. I think to me, a little bit writing the book is a bit like making bread. It's messy, it's a bit sticky, and you mix everything together and hope that there is enough kind of rise that it forms something that has shape. So it didn't necessarily start as a book, but it certainly developed into one over time.
That's a really good analogy, because there's certainly a little bit of science to bread making, but there's also a little bit of alchemy.
And intuition. I remember when I learned, they said, this is best practice. And I kind of think, my grandmother also used to make bread, and I never met her. So there was a nice lineage to her as well. But the person who taught me said, sometimes you just get a sense, and, you might stick your finger in the dough. There's practices, but you have to kind of feel it and know your way through it. And I would say my writing takes a similar shape. I don't start with a sense of where it's going to end. These swirly lines are probably indicative a little bit of my writing process. You kind of write and see where it goes in terms of some of the arguments.
Mm. And that makes me think of something else that I think we lose when we have this very science-focused, fact-based relationship with food and eating, which is very much related to that pursuit of pleasure, which is that embodied knowledge, which is what I think you're talking about. You have to feel dough, you have to smell what it smells like to know when it's done. It's, you know, it's not just about taking the temperature, which I suppose that you could do, or quantifying the doneness of bread. There's something that's very embodied to bread making, and to cooking in general.
Yeah, and I state often that my interest in food started as a balance to my intellectual kind of PhD work. As a PhD student, I wanted something hands-on. I wanted a project that kind of finished and got completed in one afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of joke that of all the years I thought I was kind of stepping away from that, food then kind of got folded into some of those questions around knowledge construction and how do we understand the object in question.
Okay, I'm going to move us on. Even as much as I'd love to talk more about that, I'm going to move us on just so that we can get to the next few slides and some great examples from the book and from your work. So maybe the next couple of questions we can answer together. So for some people reading the title of the book, their first reaction might be, well, this is anti-science, that you're just simply saying that science doesn't matter to food and health and eating. So while having read the book, I know that is not the case, but I would like for those who haven't yet read the book, for you to explain a little further, you've touched on a little bit, but to explain a little further about your stance on science. So is this book, are you anti-science?
I really appreciate the question. I think one of my fears in writing the book is that I would somehow get labeled as sort of one of these anti-science, pro-Trump, anti-vaxxer folks on the internet. And again, I will state that's absolutely not the case. I consider myself a social scientist. I see the value in all kinds of science. And it was also important for me that scientists, and I'd sort of specify here, probably namely biologists, nutritionists, dietitians, ecologists, people that work again with the physical world in which food grows, that they also see the value in the work. So part of the methodology of the book was a kind of secondary analysis of these historical discourses, but I also did interviews with registered dietitians because I wanted their say in sort of how they see these discussions. And what gave me a lot of reassurance quite early on is that actually we were in agreement. And I think we like to think maybe somehow culturally that, you know, science is this neat, exact practice. And I think scientists will be the first to say that there's a lot of messiness to science, that it's far from exact. It also changes as new information becomes available. So I actually don't see sort of, you know, the natural sciences and social sciences as sort of opposing. I think somewhere in how we take up those discourses, science gets this, maybe it's a hope or a fantasy of these sort of neat and clean lines that make up the social world. So I think in many ways, myself and scientists would be in agreement in terms of food. And I'll give an example here that came from one of the pieces of research. But if you take something like a carrot, we can say, well, we can measure its nutrient components and it has X amount of beta carotene and these sort of really strictly quantitative associations. But that's actually not true if you think about when the carrot was picked, the soil in which it was picked in. So there's some really interesting scientific work coming out on soil degradation and soil quality. Again, a contextual association around food. But it's also what we do with the carrot. If we dip it in ranch dressing, or we deep fry it, or we grate it, or we eat it raw, or we cook it, that also changes it. So I think a philosophical statement is that a carrot is never simply a carrot, and we've kind of lost that again somewhere along the line.
Yeah, and then just as someone who has a background in science as a dietitian, I would just like to add to that our bodies also are changing, and we've discovered this more and more with the emergence of epigenetics and nutrigenomics, the ways that our bodies aren't made like buildings with a set of architectural blueprints that just get translated into the building. I mean, even a building changes as it becomes remodeled, redecorated, parts break down and gets expressed in different ways. And our bodies, that's, I think, a good analogy for the ways that we're discovering more and more that our bodies are also changing. And so as the carrot changes, as the social context in which we're eating or preparing the carrot changes, so are our material bodies.
Yeah, I love that. And we never rarely eat carrots in isolation. It's also metabolized in context with proteins, or carbs, or whatever other things.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so again, I'm going to ask that we sort of put those two last questions together. So as a feminist scholar, one of the things I always look for in pieces of writing is the voice of the author. And I don't mean just in writing style, I mean identity, their own sense of who they are and their own social position or take on the subjects that they're writing about. So I ask you, how should we eat? Not for you to define for us what healthy eating means, but how do you situate yourself, and how would you recommend others situate themselves in this shifting realm of healthy eating? That there's a lot of confusion with it, as you've already mentioned.
Yeah, thanks. I will state again very clearly, as I do in the larger book, this project is not to add to more tellings or proscriptions or doctrines on healthy eating. I think many of us can agree that there's already too much of that. So I'm purposely not telling people, nor would I feel equipped to tell people how to eat. That is absolutely not my place. I think I'm ushering here a little bit more of a kind of philosophical or contextual social understanding of food. So I wouldn't tell people how to eat, but I might encourage people to think about how they eat, or think about how and what they eat, or how and what and when they eat. And I think that would link to the second question in terms of my own food and eating habits. I suspect I'm probably in good company, but I would say that I'm highly food focused. And depending on who you ask, either a little bit picky or a lot picky in terms of food. And I think, my specific food items change at times. I have been vegan. I'd say I would adopt mostly a plant-based, but not an exclusively plant-based diet now. And I'll get into the politics of that in a second. Aside from all those food item-based identities, I think my central ethic or orientation to food is actually a thoughtful one. I'm just careful, and I realize that in and of itself is a privileged position. I'm careful about where I get my food, what I buy, what I cook, but I understand fully that not everybody has the capacity to do so. So I think I'd like to echo or draw in here the important work of Alexis Shotwell's work on the politics of purity. So while I'm picky, I'm also not a purist. And I see the value in fast food for a very accessible food. It's very affordable. It's also very accessible for folks with disability or mobility related issues, for parents, for people who work shift work, that those types of things. And it can also be tasty and pleasurable. So I'm not going to draw hard lines around those kinds of discussions.
All right, thank you so much for that, Alissa. I'd like to just invite you now to flip to the next slide to talk to us a little bit about some of the examples that you've noticed swirling around us in our food and eating environments as we try to navigate this.
So this was the dairy ad I was alluding to earlier, and this came out in 2012 when I think my initial interest in dairy started, and this was like, wait a second, what are you saying? And you go on to the Dairy Farmer of Canada's website, and this kind of, bold help prevent colorectal cancer. The statement is much more refracted. So it might possibly or could in some instances. So the language is obviously much more refracted in this example. And again, I don't want to get into whether it does or doesn't. I think to me, and certainly independent research has found that in some cases, high dairy consumption actually increases osteoporosis and cancers that, again, maybe counter some of these commercial claims that we see. And I think it's easy to get into, and I find myself getting into that as well. Like, I want to know which is true. And again, cancer is very complicated illness. It interacts with multiple facets of our social world. I want to sort of take a bit of a step back and say, well, what about health and illness in this context? And that we know is sort of based on population health and research. That ties us again to social determinants of health. So I think if we zone in on this, like whether drinking a glass of milk will make you healthy, we kind of get caught up in those singular food truths. So it's either healthy or not, rather than taking that kind of big picture perspective. The second image is a screenshot. So if anyone wants to know what it feels like to live in Alberta, I would say that this heading kind of encapsulates some of that. This came out, unsurprisingly, in response to the 2019 Canada Food Guide, which prompted a lot of plant-based eating. And again, this is this kind of contradictory framing around meat that we see, but Danielle Smith of the Edmonton Journal writes, if you care about the planet, eat more beef. In the article, she goes on to vow to double her beef consumption in the name of saving the planet. She bases this on arguments of the difficulty of acquiring vitamin B12, but also of the benefits that grazing cattle, meat production can give to farms. And again, we could get into whether B12 is best, absorbed through meat or through other sources, et cetera, and so forth. I think one of the most misleading things about this type of framework or piece is that assumes that all cattle raising is equally good for the planet, and that is absolutely not the case. So feedlots and those types of things are horribly, draining on all kinds of resources. What she is referring to here is specifically kind of grazing cattle in very small farms without, thousands of animals. And that point is completely missed. So I think without that critical interpretation, and you could hear someone saying, I'm eating beef because I'm helping the environment. And that, again, gets us very quickly into this post-truth context.
Yeah, the excellent illustrations for some of the real central ideas or thesis of your book. So if you'd like to just flip to the next slide. Thank you. So towards the end of the book, you present to us this alternative food facts table to give us as you've said, not another definitive picture of how we should or shouldn't be eating or what we should and shouldn't be eating, but to give us an idea of what factors we might consider in navigating these swirling food truths and thinking about what this could look like, given the arguments that you're making in the earlier chapters of the book. So I'd like if you could to speak to the alternative food facts table that you present to us, as well as one of my favorite pieces of sort of critical food studies or critical nutrition studies examples, which is the food for thought pyramid, which I think there's very, very much some similarities between what you present and what the creator of the food for thought pyramid, Laura McGibbon, presents.
Yeah, thanks. I'd actually not seen the Food for Thought pyramid, and I loved it. I think it does a great illustration. I think you're right. There's a lot of kind of connections. I kind of see both images as antidotes or even counter images to some of the previous ones, or even food facts tables, because each of them in their own way attempts to kind of contextualize healthy eating in the conditions of living and not in the conditions of like individual food choices. So some of those factors that Jen discussed in terms of our bodies and context of eating are raised. And I wanted to add something kind of tangible. I hesitated a little bit in creating the alternative food facts table because I don't want it to be taken up as just yet another iteration of kind of added doctrines on what and how to eat. So I encourage people to kind of make their own. What would you include on an alternative food fact table? What contexts or things would you want to see included in that? And I think it's another opportunity to expand the language. I think many of us are circulating around, contextual, social, cultural, political, and that might mean something to us, but again, outside of academic contexts, how can we reclaim even the language on food? And I certainly love the focus on relationships and spiritual connections. I think that's something that the book didn't touch on into too much detail, but again, it's another sort of holistic understanding of food.
Yeah, no, I think I love the idea of thinking about if we were to create a food facts table for ourselves individually, but even just collectively, like what would a collective food facts table look like, whether that's in the context of our families or in the context of our social circles or in the context of a global pandemic, for example. Sorry, did you want to add?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, if you want to flip to the next slide there, two more examples that have come from my neck of the woods in Canada that I love and that I often show students to provoke them to think about. These are all dietetic students, so asking them to think beyond the science that they're so immersed in absorbing and trying to become dietitians. And I would like to hear you respond to these. You might not be familiar with some of the foods. As someone that's new-ish to Eastern Canada, I myself wasn't familiar with a lot of the foods, but I think that's part of what these are saying to us, is that these are very contextual things. And so I would like for you to take the arguments in the book that you present and speak to these examples.
Yeah, you're right. I was not familiar. I had to look up many of the things here, but I think they're really great examples of regional and community-based understandings of food, which again, to outsiders, I have no connections to the East Coast or understanding of sort of East Coast food culture. And I also think there's kind of a long historical pushback to kind of what comes out of federal government or Ottawa, that the maritime provinces, and I would say Alberta has as well, though in a different way, this kind of rejection of centralized Canada, i.e. Ottawa advice on what to eat. So it doesn't surprise me that these are kind of spoofing on the Canada Food Guide. I had no reference to jeet yet, which I had to look up, and it's great. It's slang for "did you eat yet?" or "said jeet yet," and I think that's great. Certainly in terms of some of the discussions. So while I have the economic and time privilege to really be careful about my food choices, I realize that not everyone did, and sometimes you're just getting calories in between shifts. When the kids are sleeping or those types of things. So I think the baseline here is just food in and of itself. And this would apply also to some of our remote and Indigenous communities, is itself a basic human right. So food is the baseline, and then some of those other discussions can emerge from that. There's some really great links to kind of regional Indigenous foods I see linked into both, as well as the pushback, I think, a little bit on conventional understandings of what's healthy. And I think the links to the beer and the cigarette and the craft dinner and the cookie notably has a smiley face, link back a bit to what I was saying around fast foods being kind of accessible and affordable in all kinds of ways. Something that I often remind my students is that where spa treatments and therapy, things that we might conventionally say are, healthy, health-seeking behaviors, those are simply very unaffordable and inaccessible to many people. But a pack of smokes and a six-pack of beer is often kind of the next alternative. And certainly for people working who are also maybe working class or having time issues, to me, these things both have a kind of historical, a cultural linkage, but also economic links.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I would add, as someone now living in Eastern Canada, I think what's important to understand that your book really draws our attention to is the way that we need to understand what healthy eating is in a localized way. So Nova Scotia historically has been for decades among the most food insecure province. It has the highest rates of poverty and child poverty of all of the provinces. Not as certainly pales in comparison to the north. But you know, that certainly is, for me, what I think we see reflected here is like you're saying, the class politics that are central also to how food and eating and health are understood.
Yeah, and I think in particular, this Cape Breton food guide, for me, if we jump back to some of these things here, dependent on mood, many of us talk about sort of comfort foods. I think that's really important for long winters, weather, and even some of the things here, you know, how far did many of these foods travel? Is it locally sourced, distance traveled, affordability, time needed for preparation? That if you take some of the examples that are listed on either of these, they actually map on quite nicely, both to the alternative food facts table, but also to these. The humor is certainly there, the socioeconomic factors, purpose and meaning, and then some of the broader context that we're looking at. So I think these two slides actually speak quite nicely to each other.
Thanks for carrying that forward a little bit. My 6-year-old needs to know how to get onto YouTube. So,
important questions.
Yeah, very. All right, so let's move on to there. Perfect. So I'd like for you to speak to us a little bit, revisit this idea of singular food truths being politically dangerous. And if you could speak, when you're speaking to that, think or draw our attention to the ways that this is politically dangerous for food studies scholars, or in the context of food studies.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a good summary question, actually, to kind of maybe bring full circle some of the discussions we've had today. I would outline singular food truths as politically dangerous for kind of 4 interconnected reasons. One, they fail to focus on the social conditions that create food insecurity and ill health. So at the end of the day, the underlying undergirding factors are, again, those social conditions, and that's where I would link to some of the social determinisms of health, and all of the great work that's been done in that area. 2, they centralize individual food choice over this systemic and structural social change. So we are often asked to read food labels, do the research, study whether the Dairy Farmer of Canada ad is accurate. Academics may have time to research these things, but the average person absolutely does not. So I turn that question back onto federal regulating agencies, advertising standards, and those types of structural things that need to be in place to remove some of this individualized responsibility. 3, they create these kind of magic bullet solutions. So drinking milk will prevent cancer, to really complex conditions of living. And we didn't touch too much on sort of neoliberalism or advanced capitalism, but I think, you know, if we stop and pay attention to a lot of what's happening with food, with health, with our cities, with pollution, these are massive, massive, massive issues. And I think they're, again, more structurally connected than they are. Yes, it matters to a degree on what I eat, but it's not going to, again, be this magic bullet or magic pill solution. And I think we've looked too quickly somehow to food to be that, or perhaps we've just swallowed the Kool-Aid of advertising and taken those bullets at face value. And then the final one, the 4th one here, links nicely to those previous kind of counter images. I think it distances people from those social and cultural connections to food and eating. We talked about taste, we talked about family and ancestry, we talked about culture. Links to the land would also be a really important one. And to me, that's where the most pleasure I find in food is the roots or the lineages that food gives us, those cultural approaches.
So how much of this has to do with the relationship that scholars or activists that might count themselves within sort of food studies or the food movement or food movements, and their relationship with science? So you talked a little bit already about the ways that the dietitians you interviewed and scientists will tell you that there's actually a really important creative element in science, that there's an understanding among science practitioners or science researchers that these things shift, and that, yes, they're not, you know, just static, unchanging ways of knowing. So do you think that part of this discussion needs to also address the ways that food studies scholars or food movements need to rethink or unpack their relationship with science?
Thanks. It's a really good question. I think there's probably a couple of different questions in there. I think science has brought about, you mentioned epigenetics, discussions of metabolism, understanding the role of vitamins and nutrients. This is all really, really important. And I think even the emerging role on, as I mentioned, soil quality, soil degradation, I am absolutely not equipped to do that research. Some of the stuff coming out about the microbiome and the role of bacteria, also really fascinating. So I think for me, the most interesting, or perhaps kind of holistic conversations, are ones that take some of those aspects, but also then link them to some of the discussions that have been happening in the social sciences, particularly around things like systemic and structural racisms, which certainly get applied in notions of healthy eating, sexisms, homophobias, fat phobias, and the ways in which discourse functions. And I think, again, scientists are not that well equipped to understand those aspects of social functioning. I also think when it comes to the question of population health, that's one that, yes, some quantitative statistics are useful, but we also have to then understand the lived realities of the single mother who's working 2 jobs and getting subsidized. And I think, again, the social sciences does a better job at that. So I think, to put it crudely, we need to keep those conversation lines open, and we need to be, again, dialoguing with our colleagues interdisciplinarily.
Absolutely. Okay, before I get on a tangent on interdisciplinary and interepistemology,
yes,
I'm going to leave it there. In the interest of time, I think I'm going to leave that last question
sure.
hanging in the air for us, and perhaps some of the people attending will pick up on that question. So, Alissa, if you don't mind flipping to the next slide. Thank you very much. I'd like to say thank you very much to the organizers, and of course to Alissa for writing this important book. I highly recommend it. I think, as I've mentioned, it's of relevance, importance to a variety of fields, food studies, of course, being one of them. And so thank you very much. Thank you to the woman who's signing, and my apologies, I didn't catch your name. And with that, I'd like to invite questions. And I believe, David, you're going to moderate.
Yeah, and I think probably possibly the simplest way, since we have a bunch of people on the line, is for people to drop questions into the chat, and I can either pose them or you can look at them. It doesn't need to be too complicated. But first of all, also just thank you back very, very much for this fabulous conversation. I was so excited to know that I was going to get to sit in a room, as it were, with you two for for an hour and a bit. And it's just been great. It's been not only eye-opening, but also reinforcing of a lot of the things that a lot of us deal with in our own work, whether it's to do with nutrition, but this question of the scientization of food and the objectification and the singular truths, all the stuff that many of us face as we're trying to get through our work in food studies and trying to help our students figure out their own paths. And yet we don't always have the language for it. So maybe, as people start to conceive and post their questions in the chat, I can just ask my own question, my very selfish question is, when you're standing in front of a bunch of first-year undergraduate students taking their very first food studies course ever, what are some of the, like, for us, we get the terminology that you've been using, but are there some words or phrases or concepts that pop into your mind quickly that we can then deploy in our own teaching and writing?
That is a good question. And I think one that I'm continually grappling with in terms of because how do you talk about epistemology without evoking epistemology or empiricism we can talk about science. We can certainly talk about, I think, one of the things I find students really grasp quite intuitively is that food is cultural. So when they think about how and what they eat, they're going to talk about their families, they're going to talk about their religion, they're going to talk about their culture, they may talk about their region in some of those examples. And I think, to me, that's the entry point. And then you ask about this relationship to science. And there's been some really good critiques on things like body mass index, as one where we can kind of say, hey, you know, your weight doesn't equal health, nor necessarily does eating healthy equal these other cultural facets. So I think it's leaning a little bit on some of the more well-worn discussions that we've seen in other disciplines, and then bringing students back to what would make sense to them in their own lives.
Super. Yeah, we'll turn it back to the personal because we're all eaters.
Mm.
There is something inherently, there's knowledge in all of our bodies. Thank you. Thank you very much. So from Sarah Sarah Martin has just posed a question to you, Alissa. Who are the key actors in shaping food truths in terms of your work? And in turn, then how do you make sense of those power relations?
Thanks for the question. Certainly, I tend to pick up mostly on government-produced food truths. So whether that be through formal food guides, which again, I think in probably, you know, previous generations, mine included, these were more formalized, brought into schools and those types of things. Now we see them maybe displayed, you know, online or through formal dietetic teachings. But I think they have a place in creating this truth. Unfortunately, I think advertising has kind of wormed its way into creating these food truths, whether it be the front of package labeling so that, you know, Lucky Charms is now high in fiber. People take that as seeing that as healthy, rather than looking at the whole content. Things like the food facts label or anything that is legally mandated to be on food, I think is part of that. So to me, it's a combination between the major players would be advertisers and government. But, you know, I think if we expand that, television talk show hosts, bloggers on the internet, celebrities, and even sometimes, and I find this quite curious, it's not something I've researched yet, but we've gotten to a point where sometimes near strangers will comment on what someone is eating or intervene. And I think, you know, how did we get to this point? So I think people have kind of internalized some of those, combining them with their own understandings of food, and then turn them outwards into this kind of normalizing discourse on what and how to eat. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that was awesome. Jen, it looks like you're thinking about something else. Do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I guess I absolutely agree with Alissa that, of course, governments, I think, have failed in the leadership role they should be playing, not in dictating what's healthy and unhealthy, but certainly in placing the responsibility on individuals. I mean, that's what Canada's Food Guide is kind of all about, is like, this is your job as an individual to not only understand and know the information, but to act accordingly and to have the money to do so. I mean, this is the commodification of food and the ways that it's simply a good to be bought and sold. But I also think it's again, to use sort of Alissa's phrase, I think it's politically dangerous for us as food studies scholars to be pointing fingers outwards. I think it's important for us as a community of scholars and activists to be pointing the finger inwards and to be thinking about what have our roles been in perpetuating this, and what are our roles going forward in changing it. Because I think that we do have a role in changing it. So what I'm talking about is when we as a food studies community are talking about healthy eating and the right to food, well, the right to what food? And the right to whose knowledge to define that. I think we need to be more reflexive collectively in thinking about what it is that we talk about when we're talking about food systems change to deliver healthy food to people.
Absolutely. I love that focus on reflexivity. And in Alberta right now, we're dealing with a lot of education reform, which is really quite ugly in all kinds of ways. But one of the things they're removing are things like, you know, sort of philosophical, critical discussions, or even discussions of Indigenous Canadian relations. And I think we lose, in losing those discussions, we then lose the ability to apply these to some of these other facets of our work. And I think you're absolutely right what role we each play in our own disciplines in upholding some of these singular food truths and not unpacking them for our students. Thanks for that.
Thank you. So there are a couple of questions. James has just posted one, and then I found another one in the Q&A, which I wasn't looking at carefully enough. So from Milena Weiss, I can see someone taking this work and its complexity and reducing it to an everything in moderation approach, or you only live once approach with food, but there's so much more familial, cultural, and contextual elements. Could you speak to taking the time to sit in the complexity and how to avoid these kinds of moves?
And that's actually a really great question. Certainly one I don't have a kind of easier, simplistic answer to. The thing that popped to mind is questions. Oftentimes, you know, if you do go out for dinner, I think it's nice to be inquisitive, you know, about the menu or to the server or to where, you know, without getting into some kind of spoof on seeing the documentations of the free-range chickens or anything like that, but kind of asking people about their food practices and about where their food comes from or what food means to them. I think just leaning into some of those non-scientific discussions of food is one way to get at that complexity without reducing it.
There's a nice quote that I use often from John Law, who talks about dealing with complexity and after complexity and within complexity. And it's something like, the problem with simplistic solutions or responses to complexity is that they tend to increase the mess. They don't actually deal with the complexity. So I like that. Thank you again. And this question then from James, can you speak to, for Alissa, can you speak to the interactions and dynamics between those with chronic illness who are encouraged to pursue health, in quotes, through food and improving their own microbiome?
Thanks, James. You probably didn't know this, but this touches on, actually, if you go further back in terms of how I first got introduced to food studies, my PhD work was actually in chronic illness. I was interested in sort of how people talked about their experiences with something that didn't have a name. And what I found, and I wasn't looking for it, was that people leaned and focused a lot on food. So I did interviews in that research as well. And people gave very, you know, detailed descriptions of food. And to me, that's sort of, I was like, oh, then I started looking into some of this food studies stuff. So I think illness, on top of a lot of the other ones we talked about, should absolutely be part of the conversation in terms of affordability, accessibility. And for those of us that have, you know, food indigestion or intolerances or other things that are highly food related, Crohn's disease would be an obvious one, or any anaphylaxis. Those are pretty rigid, singular truths, and that doesn't take away from the other arguments. I think it actually just adds to that contextual piece that we often lose.
Thank you. Excuse me. So we've got time for just about two more, and there are now two questions posted in the chat from the Q&A. So from Nikita Rose, why do you think this type of literature is not as widely seen or accepted? For example, why are books like The Wheat Belly, The Clean Eat Diet, Paleo so much more widely spread in mainstream books? I would have loved to see this type of work before entering my undergrad. However, even throughout my dietetic undergrad, we were rarely exposed to this type of literature or other types of literature.
Thanks, Nikita. Nice to see your name in the chat there. I would say this links to the earlier question David asked around sort of this accessibility. I think because I'm doing this work from an academic position, because I rely on academic traditions of writing, so citing, you know, the literature that came before me and relying on some of these concepts, whether it be paradigms or epistemologies, that again, the general masses don't have the capacity to, or training. I think they have the capacity. They don't necessarily have the training or always bandwidth to take those in. I think some of the more popular books like Wheat Belly, they're written by doctors, but they're very much pitched to a large audience. And I think the ideas are also quite simple there too. You know, don't eat carbs and lose weight. I think it draws on some of those quick fix solutions that people are really focused on or looking for. And thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, can I jump in there and just speak to that a little bit? I mean, I think, you know, with the earlier conversation about sort of the complexity, that we have to appreciate the complexity of food and eating. I think because, as you said, Alissa, people don't have the bandwidth. I think that these sort of quick fix, silver bullet, you know, eat clean or avoid gluten, are a reflection of the ways that people don't, it's uncomfortable to sit in complexity. And when it's so heavily moralized, it's not that people are looking to me for what's the right answer of healthy eating. It's that they're looking to avoid judgment, which I think is a different thing. Like they're looking to escape that surveillance that people feel when they, throw Joe Louis in their cart or whatever other, unhealthy things that they want to eat. So I think that quick fix, not that I agree with the wheat belly or eating clean, but I think that they speak to people's need for something that feels easy and just gets past this like constant moralization and constant we always constantly have to be mindful of every morsel we put in our mouths.
Yeah, and certainly there's long links to food as being a moralizing agent, and I think that absolutely continues into the contemporary moment. It's just kind of repackaged in contemporary discourse.
Mm-hmm.
For sure, for sure. Well, and one very, very simple question from Charles Lebko to round everything out. And by simple, I mean not simple.
Yes,
do you see anything either positive or problematic between food sovereignty discourse and practice, and in the sense that the movement has pushed for people to be able to define and control their own food systems? And then what do you say to that?
I think if I understand what the question is asking, it's sort of one, if taken too far, like if we just get to say whatever we eat is healthy, that's not really where this is going either. That I think, again, it needs to be some kind of balance or a conversation between, there are well understood nutritional wisdoms that, again, in taken in moderation or in context, are actually quite helpful, but they can't be sort of unilaterally applied. So I think it is this kind of fine walk or balance between being reflective, being thoughtful, and then also considering some of those broader, more formal truths around food and nutrition. I don't think that fully answered it. I think it's a great question. I'll definitely give some more pause on it.
Well, and just as you were speaking, I started thinking, not that I'm the expert in the subject, but that it speaks very much to scale, which is one of the things that I try to address a lot in my own work is, yeah, food sovereignty absolutely at a scale is necessary. And then if you make it a reductive question and you bring it down to the scale of the individual, it gets much more complex than the scale of the community that we might be traditionally or conventionally speaking about when we talk about food sovereignty. Anyway, that was my 0.0 cents. We're now out of time. The questions have been fabulous. I really want to thank the participants for popping those into the chat so that we could continue this extraordinarily important but also fascinating and super engaging conversation. You two have been, as predicted, a marvelous team for this webinar, and I really, really appreciate your time, your dedication, and all, of course, the enormous amount of planning that went into what seemed like a seamless and fluid conversation, but I know that there was a lot more thought that went into it in advance, so I really appreciate that. Thank you again very, very much to Shannon Fraser and to Karina, our ASL interpreter. Thank you to all of CAFS for supporting these webinars and for continuing the discussions that we hold near and dear to our hearts in the Canadian food studies community. And stay tuned for more webinars in the future. And just on behalf of everybody here, thank you very much.
Thanks to you, David, for initiating.
Great to see you
Thank
all.
you for the conversation. I very much appreciate it.
Thanks. Take care, everyone. Be well, be sane.